Another interesting detail about the parable of the vineyard, or perhaps the interesting detail about the parable of the vineyard, it is a kind of summary of the Old Testament. We don't need to dig too deeply into the Old Testament, especially the history of Israel after Moses leads them out of Egypt, but also their history after they've entered into the Promised Land. God makes Abraham a promise. He says, "I will give." God makes Abraham 3 promises, and in one of them, he says specifically, "I will give you a land to your descendants." And then later on, the later prophets, they point out, God fulfilled those promises. God has already fulfilled those promises to Abraham. He already gave us the land. We ruined it. We botched it. But he did give us the land. He gave us the land that he promised us to give. The promise to Abraham has been fulfilled. The book of Hebrews points out the same thing. The promise of Abraham was fulfilled. And one of the things that's clear in the historical books of the Old Testament is how the Israelites can't pass on the virtues to their children. The story, one generation after another, I mean, it's almost like a vicious cycle. There are heroes, there are certain judges who are heroes, who live the law, who hold the people to the law, who defend the Israelites from their enemies. But then in the next generation, they don't teach their children, and then in the next generation, they're living vicious lives. They've given over to pursuit of pleasure, to the pursuit of power, to the pursuit of money. They're conquered by their enemies, and then they find themselves in abject slavery. And then another hero comes along and calls them back, heroes like Samson or Gideon, just to name some names. But even some of the prophets, Samuel's sons, Joel and Abiah, they don't walk in the ways of their father. They turn aside and they pursue lucre. They take bribes. They start giving perverted judgments. And the people of Israel, they come to Samuel finally and they say, "You're old. Your sons don't live the virtues that we wanted that they should be living. Give us a king. Give us a king." In other words, they realize that they say to themselves, we've had these problems. We've had problems for all these generations. The children always fall into vice. So how are we going to solve this problem? Give us a king. And why do they want a king? They want a king because the other nations have a king. They don't want a king because they're thinking about, well, the king will help us to live virtue. The king will help us to live the law. They want a king because it's a status symbol. So it's rather interesting. I mean, the problem is a lack of virtue, a lack of temperance. Always complaining about the way things are. I say that as a summary statement of how the Israelites acted. When they were in the desert, they were always complaining about the way things were. Our Lord gave them manna. And then they say, we don't like the manna. After a week or so of manna, they say, we're sick of this disgusting bread. Give us meat. And then our Lord says, oh, you want meat? Moses, you want meat? I'll give you meat. He promises to give them quails, right? That's the promise of the quails. But he says to Moses, he says, look, I'm not going to give them meat for a day, or for 2 days, or 3 days, or for a week, or for a month. I'm going to give them so much meat, it's going to be coming out of their nostrils. And then when they get the meat, when he sends the quails and they get the meat, they eat the meat so rapidly. They eat the meat so rapidly that they get sick. They can't control it. It's like when St. Isaac Jogues came to live with the Indians, to live with the Hurons, not far from here. Right? They wanted to be with the Indians. So they lived with the Indians. They inserted themselves into the Huron tribe, and they started hunting with them. And they would write these letters. Apparently the letters they wrote back to France were daily reading. It was like following a soap opera. But people were taken up with the letters of these Jesuit missionaries with the Hurons. And the Hurons really didn't know how to hunt. The only thing they could do to get meat, as far as big meat like elk, is they would wait for the snow. They would wait for the snow to get like 3 or 4 feet tall, and that would slow the elk down. And then they would chase after the elk and jump on them, and then they didn't know how to cook. So what they did at that point is they broke open the elk and they ate as much as they could right there. And then they all got sick. I mean, these are absurd notions. These are absurd counterexamples of the virtue of prudence, or temperance, sorry. All the virtues. But we see our Lord, we see that there's something about temperance. There's something about temperance that if we don't live it, and I think if we don't live it well, if we're not vigilant about it, we end up finding ourselves in strange places. We could end up finding ourselves doing strange things. Why? Because temperance is a kind of self-mastery. Temperance is a way of, and there's other errors that could be made in temperance, exaggerations of virtue. But temperance is a self-mastery. Our Lord gives us, as we learn in the gospel, our Lord leaves the vine dresser. He leaves the vine to the vine dressers, and he goes on his travels. Our Lord gives us self-dominion. The virtue of temperance is what helps us to keep that self-dominion. It's a certain self-mastery. Why? Because not everything that we experience, not every desire that we have, should be given free rein. Our Lord tells Samuel, our Lord basically says to Samuel, I don't know if this kingship idea is the right one. Why? Because if you don't live temperance, the king, if the judges can't teach their children temperance, I don't see how having a king is going to improve this condition. If anything, I think our Lord suggests to Samuel, it might make it worse. Why? Because this king, he'll take your sons. He'll use them to drive his chariots. He'll take more sons and turn them into footmen to run before his chariots. And to be his centurions, and to plow his fields, and to reap, and to make his arms. He'll take your daughters so that they can make his ointment, and be his cooks and his bakers. He'll take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, and he'll give them to his servants. He'll take 1/10 of your revenues. He'll take your donkeys. He's going to take everything from you. Why would you want a king? And there's no guarantee that the king will listen to my voice. And the people at this point, They think this is they still think this is a great idea. Why? Because they so are taken over with status. They're so taken over with being like the other nations that they lack self-mastery at this point. They fail to see that, well, it's not, during the time of the judges, they were basically relying on God's providence. God's providence and their own self-dominion. And it seems like now they've given up hope. We're not capable of self-dominion. We don't trust in God's providence. So we just need a king. And other nations have a king also, so we should just be like them. There's no dominion over their imagination. There's no dominion over their intellect. Our Lord came to show us all of the virtues, how he lived them. And perhaps the strongest or the most poignant example of our Lord's virtues, of our Lord's temperance, is the temperance he shows in carrying out our redemption on the cross. There was a time when the commentators, they like to refer to our Lord in the temple, our Lord cleansing the temple. And it's a wonderful example for temperance. How sometimes this is what needs, and commentators would say, this is what needs to be done sometimes to help us to live temperance. But on the cross, the final words of our Lord. We know this last scene, this last moment on the cross. We know it well. Because now Jesus understands that he has achieved everything that the Scriptures asked to be accomplished for our redemption. He says, I'm thirsty. I'm sure this wasn't the first moment during his passion that he was thirsty. But now he specifically says, now I'm thirsty. Of course, when we think of things like thirst, like eating and drinking, those are the desire for pleasure. Right? Those are the first things we think of when we think of temperance. Because why? They're the most basic desires that we have. So our Lord now says, I'm thirsty. Our Lord so much had spoken about thirst, going back to the Samaritan woman. Or at the Feast of the Dedication of Tabernacles, he says, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Our Lord is indicating to us, what's the true source of temperance? Coming to me, relying on my grace, realizing that your thirst, even your physical thirst, is a kind of shadow of the true thirst that your soul has for God, of the true thirst that your soul has for me. So at this point on the cross, our Lord says, I'm thirsty. They grab a jar full of vinegar. They put a sponge with vinegar. They put it on a stick of hyssop, and they bring it close to the mouth of our Lord. Jesus drinks the vinegar, and then he says, it is consummated. It is finished. It is achieved. And then he bows his head and yields his spirit. What is consummated here? What has been achieved? Lord, we ask you, how were you living maybe just, if we don't know fully what you were doing, if we don't understand fully what has been achieved, on the first level we can understand it as being an act of temperance. Our Lord sips from the vinegar. But in addition to that, our Lord, I think, was delaying something. And he was delaying something for our benefit. And to understand fully what this means, if we go back to the Last Supper was the Jewish celebration of the Passover. And at this time, during our Lord's life, they had refined the liturgy of the Passover such that there would be 4 cups of wine that the participants would drink during the Passover. The first 2 cups involved drinking the cup and then singing a psalm, remembering, reading of the Passover, singing a psalm. The 3rd cup was the blessing cup. That's why St. Paul eventually says, our blessing cup is a communion with the blood of Christ. After our Lord institutes the Eucharist, during this 3rd cup, when he says, take this, drink it, this is my blood, the blood of the new covenant. It will be shed for you and for many for the remission of sins. And then our Lord says, I shall not drink of this fruit of the vine again until I drink it with you, new wine in the kingdom of my Father. And so at this point they sing a hymn and they leave. But they don't drink the 4th cup. And so the 4th cup is on the cross. It's the vinegar that our Lord takes on the cross before he says, it is accomplished. Because why? On the cross, now it's finished. Now the passion is done. The redemption is worked out. Our Lord has opened up the kingdom of his Father. The new wine of the new covenant has been established. Our Lord had you could say, this is an example of our Lord's temperance. Because why? He showed the self-mastery. He showed the self-mastery in a small detail. Delaying the 4th cup of a celebration in order to carry out a wonderful task, our redemption. And we know that our way of living temperance is in small things. Because we know if we don't live temperance in small things, we could lose our way. And I was speaking with the priest the other day. He says, yeah, my Mass attendance is really down. Well, why is it down? Because of sports. Everybody plays sports. On Sunday morning now. I guess people play sports now on Sunday morning. And their coaches say to them, you either show your dedication to the team or you're off the team. And people, as our Father said, they let themselves get carried away by their natural impulses. And they get themselves on a road that ends up in sadness, isolation, and misery. But of course, when a kid is 8 years old or 10 years old, it's better that he be on the team. The parents have failed to say no to their own passions or their own little inspirations or their own little desires. And so they can't say no to their children. And I just say that just as a way of saying, it's not that the Israelites started out by saying, we're going to deny the commandments. We're going to deny our reliance on God. People don't start out in their lives by saying, well, we're going to leave the faith. We don't start out by saying, yeah, I'm just going to abandon everything. And so our Father says, well, this is one of the reasons we live temperance. So we don't get, this is our mortifications in small things. So we don't get carried away by our impulses. And so that rather than being concerned about status or what our Father says, cheap glitter, trinkets that magpies gather, we learn how to do without those things. Even sometimes good things, because we realize that even these small sacrifices we make, they're more apparent than real. And by habituating ourselves in the spirit of sacrifice, we enable our heart to be filled with the love of God. Lord, we've said so little, but we turn now especially to your mother, and we ask Mary to obtain for us this grace of a capacity of self-mastery so that our hearts can be filled with the love of her Son, Jesus Christ. I thank you, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations that you have communicated to me in this meditation. I ask your help to put them into effect. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.